The modular is a fantastic tool to make generative music. It's extremely suited to create multiple dynamic voices and elements, tinker on each aspect of a sound with precision, and control how a patch moves and progresses in detail. But if you're new to modular, it's not always easy to understand what's going on in complex patches or where to get started. There's so much to say about generative music, I decided to split my thoughts up in 3 videos. Today I tackle different options to drive a generative patch and build a core for your setup. In the second video I'll talk about using that core to modulate and control interesting sounds. And in the last video I will talk about composition and balancing sounds. I'll be using a lot of fun modular building blocks in this video, so if any of these tools are new to you, it's worth watching the dedicated videos I made about them. As always, if you'd like to support my work or you want to get access to PDF sheets with hundreds of patch ideas I've used in my videos, have a look at my Patreon. You can also support my channel through affiliate links in the video description. But now, let's dive right in. Generative patches are all about creating movement and development. But even though most modules are designed to create a wide range of sounds and good modules offer a lot of modulation options and inputs, there are very few modules that self-modulate. This means you need to use dedicated modulation tools to add that movement to your sound. If you have some experience with synthesis, you know you can use tools like LFOs and envelopes to add movement and dynamics to a synth voice. For example, by modulating the filter or wave shape. In a similar way, you need dedicated modules that add movement and dynamics to a generative patch or setup. Something needs to be at the core, a control element that drives the entire patch. It might be modulating or changing parameters directly, like filters or wave shape in a voice. But it can also drive other control elements. Those elements again can modulate things directly and/or drive more control elements, and so on. This creates a modulation tree with chained effects that give you enough options to modulate multiple voices and sounds in detail. In this video I split my ideas up in 3 different categories that can all drive a generative patch or be used to control other elements higher up in the tree. You can use any of these to get started, but in larger patches you can chain or combine multiple ideas in a larger setup. The first concept makes use of a fluctuating voltage to drive a patch. This control element is a single fluctuating voltage. For example, a voltage that can vary between -5 and +5 volt. That voltage is at the core of the patch and controlling other aspects in it. You can use the voltage to do or modulate as many things as you like. And when the voltage changes, all the things it's connected to change with it. There are many different types of voltages that are suitable to drive your patch. A great example and my favorite is the smooth random voltage. A random fluctuating voltage is a great source for generative and drone patches. This is especially suitable if you want unpredictable and flowing movement in your sounds. Instead of a smooth random voltage, a sample and hold signal is another good example, especially if you have it triggered with a random gate or trigger, so it creates random voltages with random lengths. You can send a sample and hold through a slew limiter if you like to create sliding changes between the voltages. If you don't have any random voltages, you can get a lot of mileage out of having multiple LFOs modulate each other's frequency. A sequencer is another great tool to create fluctuating voltages, even though a sequencer is more predictable. If you use a steady sequencer's clock or the voltages as fixed values to achieve specific effects, it falls under my other 2 concepts, so I'll talk more about that later. But for example, if you use a random voltage, gate or pulse to drive a sequencer, you create more unpredictability in the voltages. You can expand that if you can modulate things like playback direction, skip or jump steps, and so on. Here's a simple 8-step sequence, advanced with a random pulse and modulated direction. Just like a sample and hold, you can run a sequence through a slew limiter if you like smooth transitions. To add more variation to a fluctuating voltage, you can control and modulate the depth by sending it through a VCA. It doesn't matter if the voltage is a smooth random signal, sample on hold or sequencer. If you modulate the VCA with another random voltage or something like a slow LFO, you create a signal that varies in strength and is even more dynamic. Here's a quick impression of a slow sine LFO and the result when that LFO modulates the depth of a sequence, stepped random voltage and smooth random voltage. Again, you can add slew to the sequencer and sample on hold if you like. Whatever your choice and complexity of fluctuating voltage is, it can be used to control aspects of a specific single voice. For example, by directly modulating the wave shape and filter. It can also modulate modulation sources, for example the speed of an LFO modulating the filter. And the next level is using the voltage to control things like modulation depth. For example, it can open a VCA to allow frequency modulation from one oscillator to another. These kinds of tricks are great to make interesting flowing modulated voices. I'll talk more about modulating and controlling sounds with examples in part 2 of this series, so stay tuned for that. The next level is to use the fluctuating voltage to control compositional elements in a patch. For example, the voltage can modulate a VCA to control the volume of one synth voice, while an inverted version of that signal modulates a VCA to control the volume of a second voice. This creates an inversed moving balance between the two voices. Another example is using a bipolar random voltage to open a closed VCA, controlling something like the volume of a field recording sample. This adds a sample to the setup that will only be audible when the first synth voice is in focus. I'll talk more about using the concept in this video for compositional movement and progression in the third video in this series. First, I want to dive deeper in setting up more control elements. Most modules respond to either sudden voltage increases or a threshold. That means you can use a fluctuating voltage to set up and control other control elements in a patch. For example, you can send a fluctuating voltage to a regular or window comparator to create an on-off gate you can use on other parts of your patch. For example, to gate an ADSR envelope doing something. If you have a logic module, you can send it a random voltage and a steady offset voltage to create a high gate when the random voltage is above the logic module's threshold. In quite some cases, you can also use a random voltage to progress things like sequencer or a sequential switch directly. Another example is using a random voltage to open a VCA, allowing something like a clock signal or pattern to pass through and drive samples, other patterns or sequencers in your patch. Those examples bring us to other categories of control elements I call clock and state driven. We'll have a look at those soon. First, I quickly want to mention the random module I designed with ADAC because it's perfect for these kind of patches. It generates two individual random voltages, each with frequency and level control, with CV inputs and internal cross modulation. In total, there are 6 smooth random outputs and a related gate and trigger outputs. You can learn more about the module here if you like. A clock is a great tool to create progression, and that's true in generative music as well. This control concept is based on a single repetitive pulse called a clock. This can be a steady clock, but also an irregular or even completely unpredictable and chaotic clock. In any case, it's the force that drives other elements in a patch. It can modulate things directly or drive other control elements like clock dividers, switches, logic, sequencers, and generate a tree of clock progression. Making a clock is simple in a modular. It's great fun to use a square wave LFO as your master clock, or you can use any module like a sequencer that has a clock output. Alternatively, you can use a pattern sequence as a master clock. This can be used to progress other control elements with a rhythmic progression, which can lead to fun results. If you don't like steady progression, you can modulate the clock speed. You're not limited to a steady clock or classic patterns. Think of your clock as the driving force of a tree of triggers and gates, not just as something like 16ths or quarter notes. Any LFO or clock module with CV control over frequency can be a modulated clock. You can use something like a very slow, smooth random voltage to influence the clock just a bit to create organic drift. can push the modulation depth further and have the patch move at speeds all over the place. Modulating the clock with smooth voltages will give you flowing changes, but you can also use a direct or slewed sample and hold signal. Use an attenuator if you need to control the modulation depth. This changes the clock from one speed to another and holds it steady for a while. If you want a variety of fixed speeds, you can use a sequencer or looping voltage pattern to control a clock. And even more minimal, you can use an attenuated, direct or slewed gate to control the clock speed. This switches between two fixed speeds that, for example, change the speed of a sequencer in a voice and works together with a fixed delay time in a voice or patch. Once you have a clock going, you can expand that single pulse by sending it to other control elements. A clock divider is a great start. Especially clock dividers that generate gate outputs are powerful. This turns a single clock in a set of outputs that can be used to drive parts of a patch. Another classic clock-based module is a CV sequencer. You can use it to create melodic sequences for a voice, but also as a fluctuating voltage, to modulate things, or as a control element explained in the previous chapter. And of course, pattern sequencers are great too. If you have a clock and drive multiple sequencers, you can use different sequence lengths to create shifting patterns. You can also use the clock division to drive another sequencer or divider with a division of the master clock. Especially using uneven divisions like 3 or 7 are a great way to create layered shifting gate patterns in your patches. All other clock, trigger or gate-driven modules can be used to add to your generative control tree. For example, you can use logic modules to combine things like the master clock, clock divisions or other gate or trigger patterns to make more complicated patterns. And you can easily use any clock or gate to advance or flip switches. You can send a clock through a panner and use a clock division or other modulation source to swing a clock or pattern between two destinations, and so on. When talking about the fluctuating voltage, I first explained you can use it to modulate things because that feels the most logical thing to do, and then that you can use it to control things. With clock-based things, that's the other way around. Of course, clock-based tools are easy to control things, but they can also be used to modulate things. So just to be clear, if you have something like a clock with clock divider, you can use those gates to drive clock-controlled elements like sequencers, switches, patterns, samples, and so on. But you can also use a clock or gate to modulate something like a filter or wavetable to switch between two states. As always, probably best with an attenuator if there is no attenuator on the destination's input. You can also trigger an attack decay envelope or gate a full ADSR envelope to modulate something with more control over the shape. And you can send a gate through a slew limiter to turn a gate into an attack hold decay envelope. These can be used just like other modulation signals to modulate parameters like filters, LFO speed, modulation depth in combination with a VCA, and so on. I'll come back to more modulation examples in the next video. Then, of course, gates and patterns are great for compositional progression. You can drive a melodic or pattern sequencer with a clock or division, or more creative pattern. You can use a gate to open a VCA to allow a clock from one module to pass on to another module, effectively creating a start-stop function. You can use slewed gates or envelopes to control the volume of multiple elements in your patch, and so on. I'll come back to compositional ideas in the third video, but first it's time to tackle the last control concept. Using states is probably the least common, but it's a powerful trick. This control concept is based on a fixed number of states, for example 4. Each of those states represents a high voltage or on state, and only one of them is active at a time. All states modulate and control things in a different way. So when one state is active, the patch sounds a certain way, but when another state is active, everything sounds different. So changing the selected state drives your patch. A simple way to set up different states is with a sequencer with gate per step output, like the step 8 has. Each of these gates turn active one after the other, so only one is active at any given time. Each of these can be the start of a state in your setup. Another example is a sequential switch. This module is a quad switch, so when you feed it a clock and offset voltage, it cycles the high input voltage through 4 outputs, creating 4 sequential states. Sequencers and switches can work with a steady clock, but you can also use gate patterns or something like a random voltage or random gate to drive and switch through different states. If you don't want to cycle through your states sequentially, you can take this concept to the next level with a CV addressable switch. This allows you to select one of the states with something like an LFO, or what's done here with a smooth random voltage. This will slide through the states when the voltage goes up or down. With a CV addressable switch, you can also use a sequencer to select specific states, or use a sample and hold signal to select random states. Another option to set up non-sequential states is with regular or window comparators. You can send something like a random voltage, sample and hold signal, or sequence through multiple comparators to generate gates based on the input voltage. This can even create states that overlap and are active at the same time if you like that level of complexity. CV addressable switches and comparators are not the most beginner-friendly modules though, and I haven't talked about those before, but I will in the future. So instead of a single fluctuating voltage or clock pulses, the state-driven approach gives you a couple of states. These can be the source of your patch, but of course a single high gate isn't much fun. A simple way to expand a high gate is by sending it through a multiple. Now you have a couple of gates. Again, you can use these directly or with envelopes, slew limiters and attenuators to modulate elements. For example, you can open a filter in a voice to have that voice be the center of attention while the state is active. You can use states to modulate modulators or control modulation depth, just like with fluctuating voltages and clocks. The multiplied gates of a state are also great to control composition of things. You can use multiple copies of a state to set the volume of elements like voices or drum tracks with a couple of VCAs. You can use a gate to start and stop sequencers, use a panner to route an audio signal through different effects modules, and so on. If you patch a fun tree of effects for a couple of states, switching between them is a lot of fun. If you want to expand on this idea and dive even deeper, you can add other tools mentioned earlier to create interaction between the states. For example, you can use switches or logic modules that are influenced by multiple states at the same time. So, for example, something changes in a state that follows on the active state, or only every other time a state is active, and so on. You can patch these concepts as deep as you like. All that should give you some fundamental ideas to experiment with. Stay tuned for the next videos. If you'd like to learn more, have a look here. And as always, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.